Good evening, Fuli. Many thanks for participating today. And I thought that firstly, it would be really nice for us if you could introduce yourself to us and talk a little bit about where you're born and raised and about your education. And then we go from there.
Okay, thank you, Heike, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you this evening from the other side of the world. Well, morning to you. All right, well, as you know, my name is Fuli Pereira, and I am of Tokelauan descent. But although I am of Tokelauan descent, I was born in Samoa when my parents met and married in Samoa, and then migrated to New Zealand in the 1960s, along with a lot of other Pacific people who migrated to New Zealand for work and better educational opportunities. So my parents also took that advantage and came to New Zealand. So I was brought up in Wellington, and I now have lived in Auckland for, I don't know, over 30 years, I think. And so I live and work here in Auckland, and I work at the Auckland Museum as the curator of the Pacific collections and the World collections.
Large collection. How many objects are at the Auckland Museum?
I don't know. Lots of people have different ways of counting their collections, but the Pacific collection, there are almost 30,000 objects, and the World collection is not so big. I think that one is about half as big, but it's one of the more significant, I think, world collections in New Zealand. So it's quite important for us because we have a growing kind of migrant community here.
And so you went to school in New Zealand, and you also did your university education in New Zealand?
Yes, that's right. I was schooled primary, secondary, and college in Wellington, and then I came to Auckland for university because they had a really good social anthropology department when I was looking to go to university, and so I decided to come to Auckland. But when I graduated, in the early 90s, I had a master's degree in social anthropology, and I kind of was looking around to see what an anthropologist might do in New Zealand in the 90s. And the context of New Zealand at the time was a really disruptive. We had a disruptive couple of decades before that, like the 1970s, were a time of real protest, political protest, and social upheaval. With, for instance, the demanding of social change in New Zealand. There was the anti-apartheid protests and the protests against, I guess, the racism as Pacific people and Māori people saw it, of the New Zealand government against people of colour and how we were being treated in New Zealand. And then through the 80s, there were, like a continuation of treaty grievances and the anti-nuclear stance, and actually the first Indigenous Māori language nest was established in the mid-1980s, 1985, I think. And so there was an increasing social and political awareness, I think, that in New Zealand, that there should be more inclusiveness, that Māori and Pacific people needed to be brought much more closely in all areas of society, but including museums. Mm-hmm. So we kind of, the benefit for us, or for myself, was that in the early 90s, the National Museum, as Te Papa was known then, it was the Museum of New Zealand, mm-hmm. They established internships for Māori and Pacific graduates to train to become museum curators and collection managers. So that was, yeah, so, you know, and that coincided with my having graduated with what was thought of as a relevant degree. So I applied for one of those traineeships and got one of the three. And luckily it was the one that I applied for was the curatorial one, and it was based here in Auckland. So I got to stay, yes, so I got to stay in Auckland and work in an amazing Pacific collection. So yeah, so it was a bit of serendipity, I guess. You know, here I was, fresh out of university with a way to museum work, and here was the National Museum of New Zealand offering traineeships. So yeah, it was really great. It worked out.
So you did your volunteer. You were a volunteer with this program, and then the opportunity.
No, it was fully paid for.
Oh, it was
it was fully paid for so it was funded by the National Museum in Wellington, but so I was paid, a salary.
Better.
Which was great because it covered, accommodation and travel, and it was for 2 years. And they had always, made it very clear to me that although it's a traineeship funded by the National Museum of New Zealand, they couldn't guarantee me a job at the end of the traineeship, which was fine. But I guess they were gearing up for the building of their new National Museum, the Te Papa Museum on the waterfront. So I guess the long-term plan was probably to train, some Pacific graduates to perhaps take up places as curators and collection managers once they built their new museum.
So you had already a really good inside view into what the job of a curator is, and then how did it come about that you ended up at Auckland Museum then?
So the traineeship that I got was the curatorial. So there were 2 collection managers traineeships and a curatorial one. So I applied because I was already in Auckland. I applied to do the curatorial one, and then just as my traineeship was finishing, Te Papa had already built the new building that they currently are in, and they needed people, Pacific curators or people of Pacific descent to work there and figure out, their new galleries. So I was hired initially to go down and assist with developing their new Pacific gallery, which was called Manabasvika. Which, and then after it lived its 10 years, and then after that, Sean Mellon and Kolokesa Mahina Tawai worked on, the new plans for a new gallery, which is there now for those of you who are lucky enough to. Now that we've opened our borders, you can come and see it for yourself.
Yes, that would be fantastic.
Yeah.
So did the work and entering the profession of being a curator at a museum, did your expectations been fulfilled, or are there any challenges or conflicts between your own culture and the very European construct of a museum? Can you talk a little bit about how it started, what has changed, and how you could maybe influence changes?
Yeah, sure. Yes, of course, coming from a completely different culture and cultural background and language, um, going into this very European um, establishment that is the museum, with all of its policies and processes around, very Eurocentric ideas of ownership and, and how we behave towards each other, and which I often find quite difficult even today after, even 25 years of working within the museums. I still find it very difficult. And for example, that, from small things like hosting, for instance, sometimes like for Pacific people, to appropriately establish relationships, like if you're going to have a meaningful relationship, then we must share food. And I must, as a host, if I invite you as a host to the museum, I must provide you with something to eat. We will share it. I should provide you with something warm to eat, to drink, and we sit down and we have a casual, conversation and get to know each other. Now, when the museum sees a lot of these kinds of things in terms of money, so no, you can't have a budget for hosting people because it's a waste of money. It's not prioritized. That time, which is really, really, really important if you want to, especially when you're dealing with source communities and you want to establish meaningful connections with people, you must take the time to lay that groundwork in the museum. But the museum quite often sees it as a waste of time and a waste of money. Um, just from that kind of behaviours, the behaviours of always kind of centering yourself. So the museum sees us as the experts, or its staff are the experts in their field. And my feeling is, how can we be experts if we, only read about how to weave on the loom or how to construct houses without nails? All of our expertise comes from reading and going to lectures and being lectured by Europeans about, and theorizing about other people's cultures and beliefs. But, but we're not the experts. We're far from it, in terms of the community that I come from and my upbringing. It's a real arrogance in my community and in my culture to call myself an expert, or for my seniors just to refer to me as our resident expert on all things Pacific. And kind of right down to, and in other aspects as well. It's like the human resources department who don't, in my culture, my mother, my matua, is not an individual. It's a category of women. So my matua, my mothers, are actually all of the senior female relatives that I have. And so, trying to negotiate when I can go on bereavement leave or leave to celebrate, big occasions in the families. It's like, well, that's is that your biological mother or your adopted, parent? And so there's just this chasm. There's the huge gap between what my cultural obligations are and my, how the museum views some of those categories and cultural understandings for me. So so it's everything. It's how we refer to collection items. We in Māori call them taonga, they're treasures. My people call them goa, which are also treasures. And so we talk about things as treasured, as important, as ancestral. That's how we refer to them. But within the museum, they're just called objects.
Yes, yes.
And that really it strikes quite deep. Yeah, I get almost emotional when I think about, the cultural myth, myths every single day, and all the time there's these misses that we keep talking past each other. And
yes.
Yeah, so lots of conflicts.
And as we have worked together at Auckland Museum, me as a conservator, coming from Europe, being trained in Europe, how do you see our role as conservators being trained in European way? Have those relationships changed? Is there a better awareness also in the profession of conservation of how we should work together, or has it not changed over the time you've been at the museum?
Well, conservation was the first kind of museum department that really thought about consultation, and had it in their international protocols about consulting with makers and with maker communities, before, anybody else in the museum world, thought about consultation and engagement with communities. Conservation bodies had already thought about it, had already tagged it as something really important and essential in your care of collection items. So I really take my hat off to conservators. I've never met a conservator I didn't like. And this whole idea that you guys, your profession had already enacted, appropriate behaviours and appropriate establishment of relationships. And so, I think that conservation has a lot to offer and has had a lot to offer. And many of the protocols that conservation has are also aligned with a lot of cultural views around the treatment of taonga and things like having dedicated space before you move objects, identify appropriate places to put them, and covering things when they're not being used or being worked on, for maybe for different reasons, but essentially the behaviours are really quite closely aligned to cultural values, I think. Not things like not stepping over objects, not eating near them. They're all cultural values and protocols that are shared. So, I think there's a lot that conservators can also teach our communities of makers. If you remember that one year we did Mamas in Museums, and you taught the mamas how to build a plastic fume hood, or what do you call it? Humidifier, yes. How to do that, how to safely, because today they're still, in that gap since you've been away, they still have weekend displays in their community halls and things like that. And so you taught the mamas, how they can safely hang tapa or mats for display in their, community halls, in their church halls. And so And they really loved that. All of our mamas, they're so keen to learn how we can help them in caring for their collections. And we're still today trying to say to them, don't fold mats up and put them under your bed. And it's not good for them, And so they're constantly asking, well, where can I find this material? How can I source, rolls to roll their tapa on and things like that. So you'll still remember Taika.
Oh, thank you. This is fantastic.
Yeah, and so for me, of course, the ideal kind of situation for me would be to have trained Pacific and Māori conservators, so that they may have those opportunities also to handle and to care for collections from their communities. But until that day comes, there's lots of I think opportunities for others to help us care for our collections.
You think there would be it would be a good idea for us here in Europe to consider or discuss and talk about how we can support this idea of having or giving opportunities to people who are not from European descent to study conservation, like for example, having a grant so that people can come and study here. Do you think that would be a good opportunity to fill this gap and open?
Oh, I think it would be a wonderful opportunity. There's a big push in New Zealand in the education ministries to get more young people and young women into the sciences.
Yes.
So we're hoping that in a few years we'll see an increasing number of young women interested in the sciences. And hopefully for me, the ideal would be to have them train in conservation. And I think that, yeah, European museums and universities like yours have a huge role that they can play in supporting that aspiration. Especially those places, those institutions that have Pacific and Māori collections. I think that, as part of their maybe giving back to those communities would be to assist in the training of maybe young conservators. That would be fantastic. I mean, we can never have enough conservators, right? So they won't be taking anybody's jobs. There's so much to do, as you know, with restoration and consolidation and and just the care for them.
I mean, now we'll be talking about the collections here in the museum. Obviously, Vienna has the Weltmuseum of the large Pacific collection as well. And coming back from New Zealand, being now back here in Europe, I'm faced with the same challenges again, that in New Zealand, I could work together with you. You would open up a lot of relationships and contacts, and we were able to exchange and do those projects. And now here we are back to this problem that we are that it is very difficult to have those contacts, and that we try sometimes to contact museums in Papua New Guinea or in Samoa or wherever they have museums as well, where we can start to connect with people, but it is very difficult. It is very difficult to have this exchange. And I wonder how we can improve this so that there is much more exchange and the database and the information we collect can be more correct, can involve the proper language, proper terminology. Do you think it would be really good to have Curator Pacific also here, like that the museums need to open up and actually employ people from source communities to curate their own collections here in Europe, and that there should be much more of a exchange of people, that they, for example, you would come and work at the museum here, and that curator would go and fill your position for a year. I think, and the same in conservation. I always thought that that would be probably something really good for the future.
I think so, because it's not a one-way kind of relationship, and it will also expose the Europe-based conservators and curators to our communities closer to home. And I think in that way they become, much more familiar. I think there's something about meeting the people that belong to those objects that will open and grow, I think, a deeper meaning, I think, of collection items for people. At the moment, but for instance, I said earlier that, I'm the curator of the World Collection. Now, I don't know, and we have a Muslim aspect to that collection. There are African, North American, Canadian, and Australian collections. And I would, and I feel myself that I shouldn't be the curator of that collection, that there are actually experts in those cultures that could do that work. And even if there was an exchange, it would make me feel that I might better serve their aspirations and how, and tell their stories through the displays of their cultural material within my institution. So, yeah, I think constantly about how I would deal with trying to tell other people's stories. I couldn't. And I think, giving opportunities to young Pacific people to train in, prestigious institutions also is, it's a real need that hasn't been met yet. Hopefully.
There's still a lot to change and lots for us to do.
We have come a long way, but there's still a long way to go still.
So now, to bring this to an end, but not to forget that you just finished an amazing project at Auckland Museum. You've been working on the Pacific collection. There has been lots of changes and updates. Do you want just to give us a brief insight into what you've been particularly doing to the collections over the last years?
Okay, sure. We actually finished that project about 2 years ago, but yes, it was called the Pacific Collections Access Project. And for the first time, we were, trying to practice what we preach. And so we tried to decenter the museum from collections so that we are not the experts and we do not hold authority. And the first time we could actually go to those experts within the community. And we were finally going to ask the expert makers, the language experts, and the historians from within those source communities to help us understand our collections better. So it was a 2-year project. We had identified people within those communities who could speak and act as liaison between the museum, between us and the communities. But also a really wonderful outcome was that we actually had a lot of young people on that project, museum staff, who could actually speak the language. So we were able to, for instance, I could finally speak Tokelauan to Tokelauan, makers, weavers, fishermen, and elders. And it was the first time in my life where I felt like I brought my entire self to the museum and to my workplace. And it was an incredible feeling of, like strength and pride and just pure joy. And I was thinking about it after, when I had to give a presentation, about, the fact that every single day other people feel this strength and pride and joy because they could speak their native language. They could speak English or Dutch or French, to French people, to other English people. And this was the first time. So it was almost like I had been missing something. And this again comes back to the earlier, theme that we talked about, which was conflict. And I felt that really over the almost over 25 years of my career in museums, I've only felt that once or twice, and it was during this PCAP Pacific Collections Access project that I guess it was the same for the Samoan speakers, that they, for the first time, felt like they were bringing their whole selves to the museum and to their practice. And it kind of makes, on the one hand, it makes me happy that we had those experiences, but on the other hand, really sad, because there are so few of us in working in museums still, and afforded so few of those opportunities to really feel like we're part of our community at the same time as we're part of the museum. So anyway, I'm getting a little bit off track. So what we did was we went to the experts within the community. They were able to help us understand construction, the processing of material, and how, the making of the dyes. And so we were able to not just add that kind of information, but also, some of the oral histories came out as well, and, stories handed down from the elders. And there were lots of dancing and singing and chanting, which, it was just amazing experience. And I think that, but unfortunately, it was only a 2-year project, and so we could only really fit the Polynesian collections into that 2-year period. And so I hope to do the same again with the Melanesian collections, which we have, which is the majority of the Pacific collections at Auckland.
Yeah, it is incredible to hear how important language is. And it's hard for us, probably for me, to relate to it, but I can see some parallels for me coming to New Zealand and not being able to speak my own language and had to speak English, and how much gets lost in translation when I can say this like this. I don't know how to explain it, but I didn't feel like myself anymore because I couldn't express myself in my own language, and how much gets lost, and how lonely you sometimes feel. So from that point, I think I can understand what you mean, but I think for many people, this they probably never think about that the language is of such a great importance. So thank you very much, Fuli, for really sharing with us quite personal and thoughts and feelings, and I would like to end this now and thank you very much for participating. It was amazing talking to you, and I look forward to see you at the end of this year.
Okay. Thank you again, Heike. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you and to discuss museology and conservation. And yeah, thank you for the opportunity. It was lovely to see you.
Yes.